Hello, everybody, and you're very welcome to our first talk after lunch. Hope you're all still feeling full of energy and buzzing from all the fantastic talks we had this morning. I'm honored to be here today with a wonderful, amazing set of great speakers here, and we're going to be looking at a better world, question mark, as it is in the program. So I just want to ask everybody here quickly to don't be shy and put up your hand if you've ever had an idea of something you could do that would make a positive change to somebody's life somewhere. So just some good idea. It doesn't have to be big, doesn't have to be world changing, but a good idea that would make someone's day or make a better change. Okay, so that's really, really, really good. Excellent. So an idea is always a really great place to start. But ideas, at the end of the day, are just ideas. And some, the chances of you acting on them aren't always the best. So, like for instance, looking at Dublin, the size of Dublin and Greater Dublin, we have about 1.8 million or so people. And if each one of those people had one good idea or one idea for positive change in their life, you're looking at 1.8 million good ideas. But we all know that the real issue or the real power of an idea is pushing it forward and acting on it and making the change and making the difference. So how do we start making the change or getting our ideas moving and in motion? And how can we drive impact? And the people that are here today on the panel are approaching good ideas every day, coming up with them and meeting people like yourself in different situations who are acting on those good ideas and making positive change. Sorry, I wrote notes in case I forgot anything. So on the panel here, if you were here earlier this morning, you would have heard Simon Anholt of the Good Country, and he earlier this morning spoke about driving action from a global level. We have Matt Callanan, who is a filmmaker and founder of We Make Good Happen, and Simon has made it his mission, I think, to inspire kindness in communities and spread that kindness globally, just from even the littlest acts of kindness that you can perform every day. We have Deirdre Mortell, who is the CEO of the Social Innovation Fund Ireland, and she works with people who have ideas and who want to drive action and make change through social and environmental innovations. And we have Bruen. Brett is a former director of global engagement in the Obama White House and president of the Global Situation Room. And they specialize in strategic communications and international policy on crisis management. So I'm just going to let each of these people now introduce themselves to you and just give you a little bit of background on their story and how they've come to be working in the areas that they work in now. So thank you very much. So I'm going to start with Brett, I think, if that's okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. It's great to be at the Good Summit and to have the chance to sit around inspiration and especially at this time where there seems to be so much that's going wrong in the world. And yet, I think as was mentioned in the introduction, and I find myself a fan, a follower of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who spoke when he went to South Africa of that tiny ripple of hope. And so at this time, those ripples are needed more than ever. The goodness in the world, I do think, will overcome. As my former boss was fond of quoting, the arc of justice is long, but it does, the arc of history is long, but it does bend towards justice. And so I think it's important in this age of technology, innovation, to keep in mind the big picture. We talk a lot about this with our clients when we're working on crisis preparation. You need to zoom out, because these days the tendency is to focus on that one thing that's going wrong. And yet we lose perspective. We miss the values, the vision that are behind what that company, what that organization, what that individual are doing. So I came to this work as a diplomat. I spent a dozen years working mostly in countries in crisis and conflict. What I discovered there is that we tend to get crises and crisis response wrong most of the time. We make it worse. And one of the ways that we do is we amplify the negative narrative. One of the examples I always like to go back to of our work at the White House was when the schoolgirls were kidnapped in Nigeria. Everyone started tweeting #BringBackOurGirls. And yet that's exactly what Boko Haram wanted us to say. It made parents more afraid to send their girls to school. And as I thought about it longer, I ultimately came up with this concept of let girls learn. Because what we needed to do was take the oxygen around that conversation and direct it to something constructive that people can do. And ultimately, it was picked up by Michelle Obama and helped to generate billions of dollars for the 62 million girls who were into the school and millions of others who were struggling to stay there. So I guess my opening message is thinking about how in these times when there is such animosity, when there are such divisions, when there seem to be so many difficulties, how do we change the context of the conversation?
Do I have to answer that?
Deirdre, a big question there now too. You've just been landed with. Thank you, Brett.
So I'm going to duck that one just for a minute. So I'm Deirdre Mortell. I am the head of Social Innovation Fund Ireland. What we do is we find and back innovative solutions to critical social issues that we plan to back with grants and accelerator supports to scale around Ireland. And we do that by bringing together partnerships of philanthropic donors with government through dormant accounts funds. I've spent my whole life in the nonprofit sector so far, starting with student activism around what we called women's rights in those days. My first action was to campaign to get a female doctor on campus at University College Cork. There was no female doctor when I was there. There was a part-time male doctor who looked approximately 65 or 3,000, depending on your perspective. And none of the girls I knew would go to him with anything wrong with them. So that was a kind of that was when I figured out that I needed to be an activist, and so forward. So thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, which was a remarkably open topic, I would frame it around what gives me hope. What am I seeing that gives me hope? And I'm going to talk about Ireland because that's where I'm focused, and we have some amazing international guests here. So the first thing I want to mention is what I would call women rising. And I can see it everywhere around me in lots of different ways. Girls, young girls, older women, everything from girls at the forefront of the climate strikes, the school strikes, Extinction Rebellion, and so on, right up to older women who I think were absolutely critical to the repeal campaign, and particularly in voting the way they did on the repeal campaign. We didn't get abortion rights in Ireland by young people voting. We got abortion rights in Ireland by everybody voting. And for me, it was tremendously heartening to see people of all ages, and particularly women of all ages, voting? Yes. But we also have, for example, the campaigns around getting more women elected into public life at all levels. Women for Election, which I have to declare an interest in, I'm on the board, has been profoundly successful at finding candidates the parties didn't know about, women who wanted to run, but nobody ever asked them, nobody ever encouraged them, and they didn't feel equipped. And with a little bit of encouragement, equipping, and training, we now have all kinds of first-time candidates, female candidates who have been elected. So, for example, 50% of the first-time female candidates who were elected in the last local elections came through a Women for Election program. How many people here have ever heard of Women for Election? Hands up. Maybe 5. So that's what I mean by that gives me hope, because the impact is tremendous, but you haven't heard of us. Maybe that's a bad sign for us, but fundamentally the work is being done. And it's not always visible, but it is happening. And why does that matter? Well, first of all, we need our democracy to be about representative democracy. So we need it to represent the 51% of the population who haven't been represented until now in politics. So we were at 11% until after the last election. But also, we need women to be active in all parts of life because we need our voices to be heard, both to represent women's lives, which have been a little bit silent in public discourse, but also just to give a different perspective on all of our lives. And for me, what's particularly important there is on economics. I'm dying to see the first female Minister for Finance and what kind of a budget she brings forward. I don't know if it's going to be like the ones before or not, but I really want to find out. So that's just touching on Women Rising, and just as part of that, Social Innovation Fund created a fund called Manana Heron Fund, based on our favourite Mary Robinson, who said, the women of Ireland, instead of rocking the cradle, rocked the system. And we've just provided grants to 6 grantees who are about supporting women out of poverty and into decent and sustainable work. And you might think that cause is over, but it's not. So we are winning in so many ways. We're seeing women rise in so many ways, supported by women, but also our male allies. But there are so many ways in which there's more work to be done. A second point, and a really powerful one, I think, is there's something happening in Ireland around Irish people throughout Ireland asserting our humanity. And by that I mean rejecting shame. And I see it in so many parts of our lives at the moment, whether we're finally able to have that conversation around mental health. Nobody said those 2 words, mental and health, together 10 years ago. I know because we did a survey in my job at that time, so I know that to be a fact as a baseline. Now we talk about mental health all the time. We're finding our voices, and we're rejecting that sense of shame around if I'm not feeling good around my mental health, or if I have some kind of issues there, that I have to say nothing and put my head down, cross the road. We're finding it around abortion and women's reproductive rights. The Magdalene women found their voices and were received ultimately by the President at the Oras. That was a massive, massive moment around finding our voices and asserting our humanity. The LGBT community, in terms of the organising around marriage equality, by telling stories that were real about lived experience, brought the whole of Ireland together to vote in a 70% vote. The only country in Ireland who have brought through marriage equality through a national referendum. The only country in the world. So I just see so much hope around finding voices, and I think we're just seeing the beginnings of the direct provision campaign in terms of, again, finding voice and rejecting shame. And one of the support mechanisms that, again, may not be a household word, but I think is really important to supporting this is Uplift. And again, how many people have heard of Uplift? Yeah, more like 20. So uplift.ie, I think, is one of those online campaigning tools that we haven't had in Ireland until 5 or so years ago, which enables ordinary people to find their voices on issues that we care about and to campaign on them online as well as offline. So they're just 2 themes that I would draw your attention to, and I'm looking forward to hearing more.
Thank you, Deirdre. And Simon.
Oh, Gosh, there's so much to talk about and so little time. It's nice, really, to be in a group of people who are somewhat optimistic. I was getting used to being the only lunatic optimist in the room. Everybody, or is it just they're having great difficulty hearing us? It's very echoey. I can't hear a thing. If I put the microphone quite a long way away, is that slightly better? No? Closer? Like that? That sounds horrible to me. Is that okay? Okay, we'll do that. Start again.
Okay, so what? There's still lots of good conversations.
Would you like me to briefly summarize the contributions of my fellow?
Or we'll go around and get the audience to. No, but hopefully you can all hear us. Oh, super. Okay, so Simon is going to...
Thank you for letting us know, and I'm really sorry for the other two that you didn't say it sooner, but never mind. So I was saying that I was getting used to being the only crazy optimist on every group. Dramatized the real issue in a way that I couldn't have done in my wildest dreams. Thanks to Donald Trump, I find conversations with taxi drivers so much easier than I used to, because they ask me what I do, and I won't say do for a living because I gave up on a living a long time ago, but what I do, and I tell them, and instead of saying what they used to say, which is, oh, that's really nice, I live in London, now what they say is, oh, like the opposite of Donald Trump. And I say, yeah, kind of. And that's it. We've understood each other, and it's a wonderful thing. Donald Trump is promoting very vigorously, and I believe that he believes the opposite of what I believe in. What I believe in is a concept which I call the good country. Now, when I talk about a good country, I don't mean good the opposite of bad. I'm not trying to make some kind of moral judgment here. I'm being quite practical. I mean good the opposite of selfish. And the reason why it's so important for countries not to be selfish is because that is our problem. The reason why we're in the mess we're in today, and we really are in a mess, is precisely because we've got a bunch of basically 17th century warring tribes, nations, trying to confront 21st century globalized challenges. And the two things don't work, because all the challenges that we're facing today are by definition fully globalized. We have been so much more successful at globalizing our problems than globalizing our solutions. You take a simple domestic problem like narco-trafficking. 20 years ago, Mexico could have fixed narco-trafficking if it had had the right president. Today, it is completely impossible because it's globalized. And it's like the game that the Americans call whack-a-mole. If you push down narco-trafficking in Mexico, it pops up in Colombia. Actually, it happened the other way around. Almost every challenge that you could talk about today, the challenges represented by the Sustainable Development Goals, are all thoroughly globalized. So no single country has the capability of tackling any of these challenges anymore. And the consequence of that is blindingly obvious. We must work together if we're going to resolve any of them. To a degree, we do. In the European Union, the noblest experiment in the history of humanity, we've become quite good at doing that, because that's the basis of the European Union, cooperation and collaboration. I'm a UK citizen, and I want to apologize to everybody here for the mess that we've gotten ourselves and you into at the moment. It is honestly the worst thing we could have done at the worst moment in history. Just when more cooperation and more collaboration and less nationalism is what's required to get us out of the mess, we go flinging this one at the world. But the world will recover. The European Union will recover, more importantly. Whether Britain recovers, quite honestly, today, I couldn't give a damn. But we'll see. So anyway, as I said in my brief talk this morning, the fundamental problem in the world today is the culture of governance. You can easily produce a long list of all the challenges we're facing, from climate change to women's rights, to human rights, to children's rights, to landmines, to small arms proliferation, to pandemics, to terrorism. The list is a very easy one to make. But actually it's quite distracting, because those are all simply symptoms of a single underlying factor, which is that we still haven't figured out how to organize ourselves like a single species inhabiting a single planet. We still behave as if countries were truly sovereign, as if they were little islands inhabiting their own private, unconnected space in a vast ocean. This is our mistake. The culture of governance is the culture of America first, Britain first, Ireland first, Guatemala first, Ethiopia first. Every single leader on earth is convinced that this is a sprint to the finish, and the winner takes all. It's not. Life on earth very obviously is a team sport, and unless we can learn to play like team players, we are truly doomed. So, the simple solution to the problem of the world today is that we have to figure out a way of changing the fundamental culture of governance worldwide from one that is still combative and competitive to one that is collaborative and cooperative. We can do this. It's perfectly possible. The automobile industry proved back in the 1970s that you can mix cooperation and collaboration and competition without losing out. I'm not against competition, don't get me wrong. Competition is part of human nature. As we're constantly told, competition has raised billions of people out of poverty in the last generations. Competition only becomes a problem when it's the only altar at which we worship, and that has been the state of humanity for the last 80 years. Wisdom consists in learning how to reconcile, how to harmonize your domestic responsibilities with your international responsibilities. So I'll finish very briefly with a little description of a provocation which I launched back in 2014 called the Good Country Index. And what the Good Country Index does is it tries to measure what each country on earth contributes to the world outside its own borders. So instead of measuring, as every other indicator does, how well are we doing, how much money are we making, as if that was interesting, what this tries to do is to measure how much are we doing. What is our nation's contribution to the rest of the world outside our borders, to humanity and the planet? And I think this is important because I think today what we have to understand is that every leader has a dual mandate. They used to have a single mandate, which was to look after their own people and their own slice of territory. And if in order to respect their own people and their own territory, they had to screw over somebody else's people or somebody else's territory, why, that was even better because it showed how strong a leader they were. Today they have a dual mandate. Everybody in a position of power or authority is responsible for their own people and for every single man, woman, child, and animal on the planet, whether they like it or not. They are responsible for every square inch of their own territory and every square inch of the planet and the atmosphere above it and the soil beneath their feet, whether they like it or not. And if they don't like it, they shouldn't be in a position of power or responsibility. They shouldn't be running a country. They shouldn't be running their family. They shouldn't be running their own lives. They should be in prison. Because that is the way that we head towards doom when we look inwards instead of outwards. So changing the culture of governance worldwide is a thing that can be done. And if I had 8 hours and 46 minutes, I'd explain exactly how we're going to do it. But I won't. I'll hand over to Matt.
Thank you, Simon.
On a Monday morning, I run a video production company in Cardiff, and the door opened. In walked Daniel. And the week before I'd met him, he'd been living under a bridge with a sign, a bit like a CV, that said, looking for work. Homeless, graphic designer. And it listed some of his skills. And the story started spreading and people were liking it and sharing it. But I think my key thing is the people that take action. Because liking and sharing, you think in your brain you've done something. You might share it, you might hit other networks, which might be handy. But it's the people that take action that causes change. So I went down and met Daniel, sussed him out, had a coffee, and he came into my office on Monday, and we're helping him with a creative Kickstarter campaign, an idea that he's got. And actually, the thing that really made the difference was when he walked back into my office through the door, we'd let him use our shower. And I bought him some clean clothes, new socks, new t-shirt, new towel, gel. And he came back in and he looked really happy, and he said, that's the first shower that I've had for 6 or 7 weeks. And that, I was really kind of shocked at that. And I was just thinking, well, actually, you know, we take those kind of things for granted. But we all have power. And I come from quite a grassroots level compared to, you know, the people up at the sort of policy level. But I think as humans, whatever level you're at, we all got time and skills that we can use to make a positive difference on someone else. So I do kind of, I started a kindness project called We Make Good Happen 3 years ago. And then really, I wasn't a selfish person during my 20s and stuff like that. But becoming a dad made me think about my son and other people, and also how can I inspire my son and become a better dad? And my dad was really good dealing with the homeless. We were always going down to the centre of Bristol where he grew up and gave food and clothes, and used to help out loads in the Mother Teresa group. And I was thinking, how can I be a better dad to my son and carry on the legacy from my father as well? And so I'm really into doing simple, accessible things that anyone can do, but can have this ripple effect of kindness. And one of the things that, so I started doing 403 good deeds to positively impact 12,000 people, just as a personal project. But what happened was I was putting out these kind acts out on Facebook and Twitter, and this wasn't my intention. People ended up becoming inspired and started copying the same sort of things that I'd be doing. So I'd go to a big issue seller, bring them into a supermarket, tell them to pack away their magazines, give them a basket, and just say, let's fill it up, the treat's on me. And so people started messaging me, just saying, I've done exactly the same thing. So I think it's that whole thing of what you kind of put out. You never know who you're going to inspire to do those kind of little bits of change. One good deed that I did that went viral in the UK, and I did it in Dublin last year, was getting people to think about like simple acts. So I hid £10 notes around my city of Cardiff, where I live, hid them in secret locations, and I took photos of those locations and put them out on Twitter and Facebook, and it became this good deed treasure hunt. And inside there was 2 rules. 1, don't spend the money on yourself, and secondly, go and do some good with it. And inspired all these kind of little kind acts, and you know, people would be buying flowers for random old people, and turns out that the old woman that was on the receiving end of those flowers had just come out of hospital, so she was kind of completely beaming and wondering why this random person had bought flowers for her. And even coming back to hope, because the idea had spread, and this is this whole thing of spreading positive news and positive content, this guy in Bristol, he hadn't found one of my tenors, just used his own tenor, had seen the idea, but he brought a homeless guy into his house, gave him a cup of tea, a little bit of cake, and listened to his story. And he went away. He gave him like 20 quid or something when he left. But the homeless guy got back in touch with him about a month later and said, you gave me hope. And he's now got a job and a house sorted. And it's all because this guy, Ben, in Bristol, brought him in, seen my idea, and decided to take simple action. So that's what I would kind of say to all of you. You have all got amazing skills, and just think, how can you use those skills? It could be little things. So I'm a filmmaker, so I try and donate my skills as much as I can. And I collaborated with a photographer, Adam, who runs a project called Taking Pictures, Changing Lives. And he saw a gap in the market where charities all around the world can't afford professional photos. And of course, telling a story is a great way to get people into your cause or into your charity and get them to donate. And I flew over with, self-funded, over to Africa and India, and we took loads of pictures and videos for this Hope for Children charity. And as a direct result of just those photos and videos, they were able to raise over £500,000. And that's just from like my team and a couple of photographers. So I'd say to you, you can just do simple things that can have a simple ripple of effect, or more effectively, because you can 10x your time and skills if you go, what am I really good at? How can I collaborate with a project or a charity or community group that could really value my skills and take them to the next level or reach a bigger audience? Or are you really good at IT or storytelling or photography or IT or admin? Stuff that you really enjoy and are passionate about and know loads of stuff about. And that these charities, lots of these small charities especially, they're, you know, you've got a few people and they've usually got like 30 different things that they're trying to do, like social media, photography, video, and they can't do it all. So that's what I would say to you today, is go, what am I really good at? And how can I use that and collaborate with other people? All about collaboration, as Simon said. How can you collaborate with other people to make a positive difference in this world?
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. The theme of, yeah, excellent. Thank you to everybody. The theme of this year's Good Summit is, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I think we're all often reminded of the worst things that are happening in the world with climate change and politics and everything that we're bombarded with. So I'm just interested to hear from the panel on what are the areas that they see are creating the most positive good around the world. And if I could start with you, Brett, on what you're seeing on a global level, or maybe influencing on a local level that you see going further, and just making that difference and making that positive change to make it better times.
Well, I do think there's a number of important trends that we're seeing in the world. I mean, it was mentioned before, the status of women, girls, not just here in Ireland, I think in the US. One of the campaigns that we're involved with have taken on is to finally pass in the United States an Equal Rights Amendment, because my mother actually was involved when she was a young woman in trying in the 1970s to get an Equal Rights Amendment passed, and then it sort of petered out, went up against sort of the stiff winds of masculinity and of politics. So one of the opportunities that I think comes from some of the outrage that we've seen in response to sexual harassment, in response to continued pay inequalities, and a host of other issues that confront women and girls around the world, is not just to express that outrage, not to push men out of the conversation. One of the disagreements I have, my colleague actually, Johanna, who worked with me at the White House and is now in our firm in the Los Angeles office, we don't see some of the efforts like Time's Up as necessarily the right response to an issue like sexual harassment, because you're essentially putting men on notice. You're, issuing warnings, when in actual fact you need to bring them in to that conversation. I saw this so often as a diplomat working in countries in Africa and in other parts of the developing world. We talked all the time about empowering young people. Well, you can train them, you can equip them with lots of tools, but if the system is still working against them, they are not necessarily going to be able to move the needle. And I think similarly on women's rights, on girls' rights, we need to figure out a more inclusive approach. We need to figure out how to have an honest conversation, and one in which men are at the table, boys are at the table, so that it isn't just preaching to the choir, it isn't just pushing people out, but how do we get to a place where, on a whole host of issues, and in our country particularly right now, the divisiveness is so great, and I think it is one of the flaws in the opposition movement to President Trump. I mean, when Trump came into office, there were many in my party who said, "Not my president." And my reaction was, that was the same campaign that the Tea Party and others ran against Barack Obama. And this notion that just because we may have visceral disagreements over policy, over personality, he was elected, and we have to find a way of working with him. Now, as is currently taking place, we also can find a way to remove him, but on grounds that are legal. And I think the challenge for all of us in this moment, whether it's on women's rights, whether it's on climate change or other issues, is how do we not just raise our voice, how do we listen? How do we find compromise? Because I think that has become more and more difficult in this era of social media. You see incident after incident where there's this outrage and a collective sense of wrong. But how do we make something right? How are we going to put the country, in the case of the United States, the world, back together? And I think you only do it if you're willing to sit down and if you are able to find a way. You may not agree on 99% of the issues, but find the 1% of issues that you can work on. And then the other 99% become a whole heck of a lot easier. So my encouragement is, as we're looking at doing good, how do we engage with others on some of these issues that may hold vastly different, perhaps diametrically opposed views, and advance together?
Thank you, Brett. Deirdre, one of the issues Brett highlighted was for women and empowering women. And with your work with Rising Women, what are the things that you're finding are working the most in changing that dialogue and support that you're offering?
So a couple of different points I'd make. So I was talking earlier about women rising. I don't know if anybody heard that or not, so I won't say it all again, but women rising is not a movement. That's just my word to kind of collect together a whole bunch of different things that I think are happening at all parts of Irish society, but also represented in many other countries, to your point, Brett. And I think it's a joining together of a number of different efforts. So first of all, we're seeing young women being mobilized politically and through the education system and in other ways, and making their voices heard maybe more powerfully than what we've heard before, through lots of different ways they can do that, including the climate change movement and the school strikes, but also Shona.ie does an amazing job of empowering second level girls with a positive thought every day and programs behind that. And there are lots of different ways that we're seeing both older women, younger women, and women from right across the various divides. We're seeing leadership development in politics, but also, even in Ireland at the Balance for Better, hashtag Balance for Better campaign around women on boards. So I think it's the pull factor in terms of the more women leaders you have, the more women, the more that the world is going to be changed for women as an added perspective gets put in, but also the grassroots movements. It takes both. We have to hold hands. So to Brett's point, we have to hold hands across those divides, because there's no silver bullet. I think if there's one thing we figured out by now, for these kinds of issues, particularly polarization and division over whatever. If there were silver bullets, we're smart people, we would have figured that out already. It's complicated. So we have to deal with the complexity. One of the really encouraging, I don't know if this is a movement, but a change that I'm seeing, again, I'm thinking about your point, Brett, around polarization and how can we talk to the people we find it hard to talk to? How can we open up compassion, empathy, and conversation so that we can hear each other as opposed to talk at each other? And one of the things we're seeing in terms of social innovation in Ireland is a growing movement around training people to build empathy. So there are people who think that 20, 30, 50 years ago we had more empathy as a people than we have now for a whole variety of reasons. We can't measure it, so we don't really know. But we're very pleased in our youth funds and in our education fund to back a number of programs working with young people and adults around empathy building. And I'll just give you one tiny example, which I experienced myself recently. There's a project called Narrative 4, with a number 4. That's an Irish-American project based in Limerick here and in New York City, founded by Colin McCann, the writer. And they use storytelling as a way of building empathy, and they have a particular methodology. And we did it with our team recently, and it's about sitting knee to knee with somebody. Maybe you know them, maybe you never saw them before. And this has worked with gangs in LA, but it also works with young people just trying to build relationships, or in our case, we did it with our top team. You sit knee to knee, you have 3 minutes to tell a story about your life that is meaningful to you. The other person looks into your eyes and listens deeply. Pause. Reverse it. Now, the other person has 3 minutes and I'm looking into their eyes, listening to their story and listening deeply. Then we take a 5-minute break to reflect, take notes. And then we come back into a circle with a wider group, and I tell their 3-minute story and they tell mine. To do that, I have to walk in that person's shoes. I am living their life emotionally and experientially. One of the things that amazed me about that experience, which I found absolutely transformative, I actually adopted the other person's tone of voice. Higher, lower, male, female, slower, faster, in order to tell their story. We all did that. We didn't even notice that we did it. We literally became that person. Some people changed the way they sat or moved. So I found that to be a transformative experience, and I thought I was quite an empathetic person. But walking in someone else's shoes is life-changing. It certainly changed my life. And I'm so thrilled that that's a program that's happening in loads of secondary schools in Limerick and loads of youth groups, and that we are supporting in Social Innovation Fund to scale up around the country. It's an example of a simple methodology, but I think it represents a wider movement in Ireland and internationally around how can we bring empathy back to the centre of our skill sets as human beings so that we can talk to people who are not like us. We can all talk to people who are like us. How can we find those commonalities and build relationships with people who are not like us? Politically, racially, in terms of class, whatever that might be. And I find that hugely encouraging. I'm going to point at Michael Shevlin down there in the front row, and David, who's with him. What Michael is doing here in Trinity with the Centre for People with Intellectual Disabilities, a big part of that is around empathy building and inclusion, and I'd encourage you to go to his session after this at 3 o'clock to hear more about that. So thank you.
Thanks, Deirdre. I'd just like to ask Matt now, because I know you talk to a lot of people and share their stories, and I think the human story is a very powerful way of getting a message across and sharing a view, and as you said, that empathy as well, like, you know, and having that sense of really understanding and feeling the power of what somebody else is going through. And I know you, especially recently, you started the podcast, We Make Success Happen. And if you could tell us maybe one of those powerful stories that really showed you a really strong sense of positive positive change, and it just really brings the human experience to the fore.
Yeah, so I wanted to spread the kindness around, and originally I was going to call, and I'm going to speak about this later, but I wanted to call the podcast originally "We Make Kindness Happen," and I quickly realised we'll probably be speaking to the converted, and that's not the it's not the audience we want to go after. And if anyone's looked at the non-profit categories in Apple, it's pretty boring. So I didn't want to be amongst that audience. So I've got this kind of project that's going on at the moment, is how I'm basically conning men in particular into kindness. Because I realised when I looked at the stats of my Facebook group, it's like 6,000 people engaged, but only something like 13% are men. And I thought, well, it's quite hard. And when you actually look at the science behind it, there's been lots of tests, and women are just generally more kind and more generous. So I'm subtly, through the podcast, trying to interview not only like successful business people, but there's that subtle undercurrent of kindness. And I know it's working already, because the first podcast that I did was with this former fighter jet pilot who's a Red Bull adventurer. And I interviewed him, and a guy that he knew listened to that podcast about the adventurer, and then carried on listening to the next podcast, which just happened to be about this guy, Adam, the photographer that I was just talking about, that takes photos in India and Africa. And he ended up being so inspired by what Adam had seen, they ended up donating. I think I've told this story, haven't I? About the camera. But I think actually having a podcast and letting people be subtly influenced by kindness, I think that's a really kind of clever way to actually deliver content. I think the guy that I've just interviewed, he's got a really good story. The Madlug company just over there. If you go over into the exam hall over there, so what he's doing is creating bags for children that are in care, because he came across the fact that there's 90,000 people in children's care, and when they get moved from different houses, they're given a black bin bag to put their clothes in, and he was moved by a story of this girl that basically just said she didn't have any dignity because they were given this black bin bag. And what Madlug is doing is giving them a sense of dignity back. So you can go over now and buy a bag from Madlug, and they've got this one-for-one model, kind of like the Tom's model. And when you buy a bag from Madlug, they actually give a bag to one of these kids in care, so they can actually, when they unfortunately have to move house, they actually move in dignity. So I think it's those kind of little things that actually you can have a positive impact, and you can go over there now and buy a bag from Madlug.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. And Simon, then, I know you spoke earlier this morning about the globe, people thinking globally or thinking locally. They're not rival fractions. They coming together, they can, they're both trying to make positive change. And if you could just give us a couple of more points on that.
Well, the thing I said this morning is that, and apologies to people who've heard it already, this artificial conflict has been invented between localists and globalists, and it's really quite new. It's quite a new idea, and I said this morning, I think it's one of the most dangerous ideas in the world. This idea that if you are very locally focused and you care very much about your own village, your own people, your own territory, then you must hate the globalists who care about the world. And if you're a globalist who cares about the world, you must hate the localists. This is such nonsense. I mean, one hardly knows where to begin, not least because the distinction is a completely false one. I don't think I've ever met anybody in my life who only cares about the whole world and doesn't care about where they come from, or vice versa. We're all both. And whenever I meet, as I often do, people who vote for nationalist politicians, or people who voted for Brexit, or people who voted for Trump, I just that, surprise, surprise, they are human beings just like I am, and they're neither mad nor bad nor stupid. They just find their comfort in a slightly different way. I happen to find my hope looking forwards and outwards. They happen to find their comfort looking backwards and inwards. There's no value judgment there. Those are just two character types. And we can both sympathize with both, and we both urgently need to work together. What I said this morning was that I'm so busy worrying about the whole world because I have delusions of grandeur, that I don't have time to worry about the tiny village I live in. But there are lots of people who work very hard for the betterment of the tiny village I live in who don't have time to worry about the world. I'm glad they're doing it. They should be glad I'm doing what I'm doing, and we should be working together. So one thing I really would urge us all to do, and I urge myself to do it the whole time, is to be very, very careful about these confected tribalisms that we're constantly being sold by sources unknown. It's obviously in the interest of certain political factions to make us fight each other. We mustn't. We must get on together because, as I said before, collaboration is the key. And Sharon, you asked earlier about what it is that makes us hopeful, and the answer that I prepared before you went and asked me a different question was the thing that makes me hopeful right now is kids. The thing that makes me hopeful is, to pronounce her name correctly, Greta Thunberg, or Greta Thunberg, because she's showing us that we have reason to hope. Because kids increasingly are brought up, trained, again, I said this morning, to run towards the grand challenges instead of running away from them, which is what my generation and others have done. I just happen to think that it's still too piecemeal, and this is why I'm launching this new project, The Good Generation, which is attempting to come up with a global compact on educational values that can be taught to all children in all countries all around the world right now, so that we get a whole complete generation of Gretas, not just about climate change, about everything else. Because there is an educational vaccine for every one of the grand challenges. If you teach children cultural anthropology at the age of 6, they are incapable of racism when they grow up. Incapable. You've inoculated them against it because they take a scientific pride in understanding cultural difference. I know that one works because I tried it on my own children. My son became a black supremacist when he was 14. He's not black, but he thought he was. And he's settled down now, but it's really quite inspiring how effective that one is. If we want to teach our children not to pollute or to switch off the damn light when they leave the bedroom, then teach them oceanography. So there is an educational vaccine for every single one of the grand challenges, and it's a kind of duh moment when we realize it doesn't matter what the question is, the answer is education. And if we bring up a generation, as I say, that runs towards the problems, then the problems will go away. If we can hold our nerve for one generation and do it that way. The other thing, sorry, I can only think of one thing per day, so I'm just going to repeat what I said this morning. The problem is, as Greta and that generation have shown us, they have the right attitude at last, but they don't yet have the solutions. My generation, we have a lot of the solutions, but we certainly don't have the right attitude. So somehow or other, we've got to get together, and the answer, yet again, is collaboration, but collaboration between the generations. And one other thing before I shut up. The great thing about collaboration across barriers, whether they're age barriers, or cultural barriers, or language barriers, or gender barriers, or whatever they are, is that the result is always more productive. The more you collaborate across borders, the better the results become. So when I tell countries that they need to work together, I'm not asking them to commit an act of charity. I'm not saying they should do this because it's the right thing to do. I'm saying they should do it because it's in their interest. If you have a problem, let's imagine there's a problem in Ireland, which is, I don't know, nurses' pay in County Cork, right? The traditional way of solving a domestic problem like that is you get a bunch of functionally identical Irish policymakers to sit in a room and figure out what to do about nurses' pay in County Cork. And the chances of them coming up with anything new or imaginative, or even, dare I say it, a silver bullet — I do believe in silver bullets from time to time. Hard work too, but occasional silver bullets, otherwise we'd get nowhere. They won't come up with one. If, on the other hand, the local governments say, let's get together with a local government in Sri Lanka and a local government in Sierra Leone — okay, we're on an SL thing here — and a local government in St. Louis, and a local government in South London, and we all get together and we talk about nurses' pay, we will, by definition, produce more ideas than we've ever seen in the whole of our lives, because your cultural background defines the ideas that you have. So this is in our interest. This is the wonderful thing about globalization. It creates this extraordinary power of cultural mixing. The world's national anthem should be Stir It Up by Bob Marley. The more you stir things up, the better the ideas. This is why globalization is the only and the best thing that we've ever invented, and why we should believe in it and continue with it, maybe in a more sustainable way. But
Excellent, thank you, Simon. I'm just going to ask if anybody has a question for any of the speakers here. To just, yeah, and come over and let you.
I really like the point regarding empathy, and it kind of seems to be a thread that's through a lot of your pieces around common understanding and collaborative function. You mentioned some great ideas about developing empathy, Deirdre. How can we take that to a grander scale? How can we use empathy? Because I think we talk a lot about kids and developing empathy in kids. Can we restore empathy to adults? Can we bring that back? Is there a way? Are there any ideas around that?
I don't know. What do you think? What do people in the room think? I think that's a really hard question. I believe it can be done. I'm not quite sure how, because if we're working young person by young person at the kids level, that takes a long time to scale with the grown-ups, and you can't just send them into the program. So I think that's a really interesting challenge, and some of it is about role modeling. Okay, so I think one of the things Obama role modeled really well was empathy. He didn't call it anything, it was just who he was. But I think a lot of people went, he's different as a political leader, what is it? I think that's what it was. I'm sure there were lots of other elements to it. But so role modeling is a big part, but how can we get beyond role modeling, and how can we not get empathy sidelined to something as, well, that's for the women, they can do that, but the men don't need to. So I think there's all those challenges, but I'd love to know what people in the room think. There's loads of really bright sparks in this room. Down there.
So pretty much I've thought about this quite in-depthly. Sorry, I get like anxiety when I talk in large audiences, so this is actually uncomfortable for me. But pretty much a habitual behavioural change. So we need a scenario where we're legally allowed to cause harm that we don't have to cause, and then we have to give them the freedom of choice not to cause it. And then over about 3 months, a consolidation of an everyday pattern. The anchored thought every day, then the triggered thought applied every day, then anchors over 3 months, roughly, for habitual behavioural change to take place. So we need to find scenarios in the world where we're legally allowed to cause harm that we don't need to cause, and then give people the choice not to cause it. So when I was looking at it, there's things like plastic. When you're buying, say you have a problem, you're picking a solution to solve the problem. That's pretty much what life is, coming across obstacles and then picking solutions to solve them. So when you have a problem and you have a solution to solve the problem, you have to pick the solution that's less negative. And then that pattern then will ingrain in you. So I was looking at it and I was thinking, for habitual behavioural change to happen, for those anchorings to take place, it has to be regularly occurring. It can't happen every 2 weeks, this anchoring thought. So like say plastic in packaging and things, or clothes made in third world countries and the bad conditions and things like this, they don't happen regular enough to happen. So pretty much you have this arc. If you bend your finger and you see your arc, pretty much what you're doing is, it's very hard to visualize it from you here, but if you imagine like an arc, like going like this, like a rainbow, and then along that, what you're doing is, whenever you're coming across an obstacle, you're asking yourself, is someone losing out when they don't need to? Yes, don't accept, no, accept. So you do that every time. But again, if that question, that triggering question happens every 2 weeks, it will start to regress. So you really need to do it every day. And the only thing that we do every single day that involves harming another individual and we don't need to is actually our food consumption. And actually that's why it's my belief that veganism can be used as a tool for peace, for habitual behavioural change to take place. So every time I have a problem, I need to pick a solution to solve it 3 times a day, every day. So I anchor that thought every single day. So I ask myself when I'm picking a product to solve my problem of hunger and need and food and nutrition, is someone else losing out when they don't need to? Yes. Don't accept. No, accept. So with that there taking place, that would actually then change your behavior to never want the benefit of someone else's loss when you don't need to. It's empathy driven first, and it's that kind of mechanism that needs to take place for it to consolidate. Now for myself, living this way about 6 years, after this took place, it's my premise thought. So even if I'm facing an obstacle in an area not related to food choices or whatever, it's my first train of thought. If I'm buying a pair of shoelaces, I'm going, is someone losing when they don't need to? It becomes an inherent thought. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So having the constant reminder.
Sharon, can I just say something in 30 seconds? Really, I'm sorry I've spoken too much, but I have a view on this. I think the human race is divided into two parts. There are clinical psychopaths, and there are people who are not clinical psychopaths. I don't exactly know what the proportion is, but it's probably less than 1%. If you are not a clinical psychopath, you possess empathy. And so I think if we had to train people to empathy from zero, it would be a hopeless task. I think, and I'd love to know what Matt thinks about this, it's more about giving permission to feel and to execute empathy. We all have it.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, do you want to jump in?
I need to add, I think it just takes a few people to be... I've heard the saying like the penguin off a cliff. So I heard this explained by someone else. Basically, you need someone to take that first leap, or just do a little bit of action and say, oh, it's actually okay, and get over that fear thing, and then other people will follow. So we need more people to be those people that takes action first, because others in your community or your groups will follow.
Okay, very good. And did you have something you wanted to add to the empathy?
I think I might have lost the trail here on the question. You were addressing children, right? Right, and an example popped up with a partner that we collaborate with, Lego Foundation, and they do really good work. Their serious play and how they bring it into rooms and put context. And I think with the younger audiences, they sort of, most times they feel that they're not heard. Their questions might be a little bit more simpler because they need to put things into frame. Where do they come into this entire big picture? But Lego's doing really good work there. And I've seen examples as well with peer-to-peer development that bridges the gap between intergenerational exchange. So we talk about the more sensitive topics like anxiety, feeding yourself, taking care of yourself first, things like that. And then that's just a thought that came to mind. Bridging that is really important. But check out Lego.
Very good.
Sorry, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for what you said. I just wanted to ask two really quick questions. First of all, I agree with what you said about doing kindness. I really value that. But what I wanted to ask you is that, how can you do kindness without actually suppressing the other person and being patronizing? That is the first thing, because sometimes one's kindness can begin to patronize, especially those who don't have enough, and they feel, well, I've got to be grateful for this, but you're actually suppressing their dignity, and we're trying to talk about the better good. So I'm thinking, how can you do kindness without suppressing the other one through patronizing? And then the other thing is that, as a black woman, a woman of color, one of the things that I recognize that has been, when photographs of charities come out, they tend to be snot-nosed kids and stuff that makes you feel, well, we've got to give to this because look at how they are. But how do you preserve dignity in those photographs? Whether your photographs had, I was quite happy to see this. She's a happy-looking person, not snots and flights on her nose. And I would like to say, okay, hey, listen, if we're going to help one another, it should be on the same level, that will preserve the dignity and will not patronize those who are less than that. Because what we do for our children then is that, sorry to say it, the European children feel, well, we can help them. And then the other children, on the other hand, feel, well, we need to be helped. But the reality is that globalness is that everybody can help each other. So how do we stop that top-down, patronizing, loss of dignity, and still carry out the kindness? That's what I want to ask.
Yeah, so on the kindness front, I always say to people, if they're going to, because obviously there's a lot of, for some people, getting over fear of speaking to strangers or going up to a homeless person. And I would always say, just go up and speak to them. They're another human. And actually, instead of just going, I'm going to get them lunch, go and buy the lunch and then give it to them, go and speak to them first. If they're selling a copy of The Big Issue, buy a copy of The Big Issue and buy that first. And then say, look, I'm just going to go and grab some lunch. What do you fancy? Because actually, by doing that way, they might go, no, it's all right, I've just eaten. Or they might be vegetarian and you've bought them a chicken sandwich or something, and, you know, that'll annoy them even more. So I think it's actually just speaking to people, seeing them as humans, like me and you first, speaking to them, and just gauge the reaction, and actually just say, look, and actually just by building it into your everyday life, by not making it a special cause, by you saying, I'm going for lunch, do you fancy anything? It's not going, I want to buy you lunch because I want to do a kind act today, or I want to feel good. It's actually just sussing out the situation and building it into your lifestyle. So that's what I would always do. And also, the other thing is, while doing kind acts, you can actually say, look, I've got to do this because I'm doing a kindness project. I've got to do this today, and you will be helping me. By actually putting it back onto yourself, by you saying, you can help me, it kind of takes the attention off them. And on the kind of like promotion and sort of the kind of grief thing, there is this whole thing of charities, unfortunately, playing up to, you know, showing the most awful situations they can. And I think I'm a really big believer in trying to show more authentic, positive outcomes and getting people engaged that way rather than just going for the, you know, and I think there's big charities that do this all the time. That just show the worst situations, you know, babies crying, you know, kind of in amongst rubbish and stuff. And unfortunately, that does happen, and that will get people on board. But I'm much more about showing the positive outcomes, and then they can talk about where they actually came from. I'm sure other people can add here as well.
Okay. And was there one more question over here? Sorry.
How you doing? My name's Karina, and I set up a non-profit myself 2 years ago, and it's been a big journey of discovery, and things I've learned over the last couple of years have been ignited by, inspired by so many people out there that are really struggling. I myself 3 years ago decided after I spent 9 years at home, my kids, the bubble burst, and I found myself back out in the workplace wondering, where do I go from here? And I had a real passion to kind of make a difference and set up something, and I went on a journey of self-discovery, and I launched 3 years ago. But my journey changed when I had a close friend who had a little 11-year-old boy who was struggling. He was self-harming and he wanted to take his own life, and I realised then I couldn't sit back and do nothing about this. I have 2 kids of my own, and I decided, that's it, I'll reach out everywhere and I'll build the best team I could possibly find, and I'm going to make something happen and make changes. I don't think we can, we all know that we can't depend on our government. There's too much out there, too much confusion, and nobody knows where to turn. And there's so many incredible organisations out there that offer so much. So I spent the last 2 years working relentlessly to build the best team I could possibly find. I'm now just, this guy asked the question about how do we teach grown-ups and parents and people empathy. I think we have to learn from our children, our young people. That's where we need to start. But how are we going to teach these kids? And I think that going through the educational system, the way things are at the moment, something needs to change drastically. I'd have to say, I'm sitting here shaking now. That guy down the back, fair play to you, anxiety. I still have put myself out there, and I think it's very difficult sometimes when you're standing in a space of, you know, you're really passionate about something to kind of, you know, there's so much needs to change. But getting back to this question of empathy, we all know that, you know, something needs to change, and I think something has to be taught through the educational system. Who creates the curriculum? The subjects that are, you know, are rammed down our kids' throats, and they're regurgitating this information that they'll never possibly use in their lives. So what's the fundamental thing that every young person has got to learn is how to handle life, how to cope, how to manage. So are we doing something wrong? I want to know who's creating the curriculum, and Why is there not a subject that's promoting their mental health and their well-being, and taking that on board and making this a curriculum? Because at the moment, I'm creating curriculum with a team. I've got film crew, I've pulled out all the stops, and I've got professional experts that are willing to create this curriculum, and it's all a free online resource that a new academy is all about. I think that's where we really need to teach every young person how to handle life. And thank you so much, because it's been very inspiring listening to you all, and it's great to see what's going on. So yeah, I'll stop waffling on, but yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I think our time is nearly up, and the theme of today, of this talk, was a better world. So I'd just like to ask the panel, I suppose, as a parting word, like a positive quote or inspiration, or something that would maybe as well speak to what we just heard there as well, on having that idea and getting started and keeping motivated. If you'd like to share something.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, going back to the guy over there about change, I would think about, right, how can you use your time and skills for good, and also how can you change your lifestyle to be more positive? So I'd think about just doing +1 a month. You could do +1 a week. So what positive change? Could you go for coffee in a social impact kind of cafe that employs homeless people? Could you change your lifestyle that 1 month? Could you then start subscribing to the big issue as a company or as a person, and then the next month try doing something different? And over the year, you would have done 12 positive differences, which will have ripples beyond what you can think sometimes. So yeah, I just do think of one small step that you could do a month for the next year, and even if one person in this room does that, that's enough, I think.
There are no silver bullets. We disagree. But exactly. So leadership, I think, is really important here. And the point I want to make about that is, I think a lot of the time we like to think about leadership by pointing over there, or over there, or over there. But a lot of the time leadership is about pointing in here and recognizing that we all have the capacity to be leaders in our own lives. So can we call ourselves to action? And what is the thing that I can do? What do I want to do, and what can I do? And within the constraints we all have in our lives. But maybe just to try and reframe it around, there are things that everybody else could and should be doing, but what can I do? And maybe I'm doing it by myself, and maybe I'm doing it with some other people. It doesn't really matter. Maybe we're collaborating. Maybe it's, how can I be kinder to my kids today? How can I think about not reacting when they're grabbing the Coke out of the fridge and they know they're not allowed to have it till Saturday, but instead walking in their shoes and saying, why are they doing this, and how could I react that bit differently? So it can be those tiny little things, or it can be something really big. It's different for all of us. So I wouldn't like to be prescriptive, but maybe it's just about saying, maybe I'll just have a look in here. And I can also point at other people, but let's look in here as well.
I guess I'll leave you with two final thoughts. One big picture and one really practical. On the practical front, I discovered when I was working at the White House the power of convening. And you don't have to be at the White House to bring people together, to bring companies, to bring leaders, to bring organizations working on a variety of different issues, because oftentimes we are quite segmented, we are quite siloed. And I think one of the roles that civil society can and increasingly must play is as a convener, identifying a problem and trying to get big companies and government and civil society organizations around the table, not only discussing it, but looking at actions. Because now in the work that we do with large companies, they often, are focused on becoming, the best widget salesperson ever. They simply do not have the capacity, let alone the awareness of how they could do more good. So helping them to do that. And I don't think it is a very difficult process to organize that conversation. In some cases, you have to perhaps, publicly shame them into coming to the table, tweet about it, encourage others to press them, but get them to the table. The last point, which is a bit to your question, is I fear, and this comes from some of the work that I was doing against Russian propaganda when they invaded Crimea and later Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, is that the West has really lost our story. Last night at the reception, I talked about the importance of Franklin Delano Roosevelt standing up before Congress at the height of the Second World War and laying out this vision of 4 freedoms, and then how steadily over the following decades we have gotten, at least in the United States, farther and farther away from that. What do we stand for now? What are we teaching our children? And I think we have to rediscover, both as a global community, but it can also start locally, in trying to really reinvigorate that sense of purpose. Because having worked against, whether it was ISIS propaganda or Russian propaganda, so often we define our work in terms of what we are against. What are we for? And what is it as a community? And then hopefully, ultimately, it becomes infectious and it spreads. But I think we need more people. We need more organizations that are out there trying to advance a positive story, an inspiring story about who we are and what we can become. Because we truly have lost that visionary sense, that ambitious sense. And yes, we have to tackle the challenges of today, but I'm interested also in how do we rally this generation to the promise of tomorrow.
Thank you, Brad. Simon, if you have a quick word, because I know we're over time now and we need to wind up.
Okay, well, the 3 things that I tell myself on a regular basis. The first one, to consider the immense diversity, the wonderful, fabulous diversity of the human species, which has been brought ever closer to us by the forces of globalization. We're so lucky that we have this power at our fingertips. And to what the lady said earlier, I absolutely concur with that. The idea that we reestablish and we reinforce these imaginary hierarchies between nations, it's the ones at the top that have to help the ones at the bottom. This is an odious idea. We all work together, and that's what creates creativity, that's what produces ideas. So even if you're wondering what to buy your mother-in-law for Christmas, instead of asking the members of your family, pick all the people you know on social media who come from different countries, and you will find that you will get more ideas than you possibly know what to do with. So use diversity not as an excuse for political correctness, but as an incredible treasure house of imagination and creativity, and ultimately the solution to all of our problems.
Love it. That's really good. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Deirdre. And thank you, Brett. And thank you, everybody, for coming along and joining in the conversation. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.